Owning a copy of this newspaper could get a black man beaten, arrested, or executed. Governors and sheriffs across the South feared it, yet it also turned a rejected lawyer with 25 cents into one of the richest black men in America. For decades, it thrived, until the founder passed away and his family tore it apart, fighting over ownership till nothing was left. This empire survived 2 world wars and legal persecution, but still ended up destroyed by its own family. Join us as we find out how, through the rise, ruin, and fall of the Chicago Defender. Chapter 1. The Man Who Built a Weapon. Everything began in 1905, inside a rented room on Chicago's South Side. Robert Sengstacke Abbott owned little more than a card table, a borrowed pencil, and 25 cents. He was at a point where it seemed he'd been lied to all his life. On paper, he had done everything right. He had earned a law degree and dreamed of becoming an attorney. But it seemed reality had other plans. Racial segregation was at an all-time high back then, and no white law firm would hire a black lawyer. It was so bad that many black families couldn't even afford legal representation. Every door Abbott knocked on stayed firmly shut, rejected on all fronts. After years of trying, he reached a painful conclusion. If the law wouldn't let him fight for his people, he would have to find another way. And so he decided to start a newspaper. He called it the Chicago Defender. Many things made the idea sound almost hopeless. For one, it was a black-owned newspaper, launched with almost no money, planned to launch in a country where most publishers wouldn't give it a chance because of the color of his skin. Yet that tiny publication would eventually become the most influential black newspaper in American history. Before long, governors, sheriffs, and politicians across the South would come to fear its arrival more than almost anything else. But first, Abbott had to convince someone to read it. His earliest editions were only 4 pages long, written and edited on his landlady's dining room table. No newsstands wanted to carry a black newspaper, so Abbott became its printer, salesman, and delivery boy all at once. He folded each copy under his arm and walked block after block across Chicago's South Side, knocking on doors, stopping strangers on sidewalks, and handing papers to anyone willing to give him a chance. The few that did give him a chance would end up being his biggest supporters. And it was for one important reason ignored by most white publishers. Millions of black families weren't hungry for news. What they wanted more than knowledge of current affairs was hope. They were desperate for a way out of the current system built against them. So instead of filling his pages with politics alone, Abbott filled them with possibility. There were just a few pages in his newspaper, yet he would use a huge chunk of the space to publish factory job listings from Chicago that paid wages many Southern workers could scarcely imagine. He listed train schedules and ticket prices so readers knew exactly how to leave. He printed photographs of black families standing proudly outside homes they actually owned, children sitting inside real classrooms with proper books, and workers earning enough money to build comfortable lives. Every edition carried the same message of hope. People loved it for this, and the message spread faster than anyone expected. However, it also terrified the people who wanted racial segregation to last forever. Southern officials quickly realized the Defender wasn't just reporting events. They figured that it was also encouraging black families to leave plantations, mills, and farms for northern cities. And so, they decided to take action through the authorities. Town after town began banning the newspaper outright. In some places, simply being caught with a copy could lead to a beating, jail time, or something even worse. But banning the paper somehow caused people to want it even more. So Abbott built one of the most remarkable underground distribution networks in American journalism. His secret weapon wasn't another publisher. Rather, he decided to use Pullman porters, black railroad workers who traveled between northern and southern cities every day. He'd hide the newspaper inside luggage compartments and baggage cars, and dozens of bundles of the Defender would cross state lines before being slipped into churches, barbershops, beauty salons, and neighborhood businesses. One newspaper might pass through dozens of hands before it finally falls apart. And the more the authorities tried to stop it, the farther it spread. But everything changed when Abbott decided to make the boldest move of his career. In 1917, he'd launch what he called the Great Northern Drive. Through the pages of his own newspaper, he openly urged Black Southerners to leave the South behind and build new lives in northern cities. Week after week, the Defender gave readers not only the courage to leave, but also the practical information to make the journey. It told them where jobs could be found, where trains departed, where families could settle, and what opportunities waited once they arrived. Historians now see that campaign as one of the driving forces behind the Great Migration, one of the largest voluntary movements of people in American history. Over the following decades, millions of Black Americans left the South for cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and New York, reshaping the political, economic, and cultural future of the United States. And as more families boarded trains heading north, Robert Abbott's influence and his fortune grew right alongside them. The 25-cent newspaper nobody believed could survive was now becoming one of the most powerful media businesses in American history. But what happened after that was even more incredible. Chapter 2: The Birth of an Empire. Within just a few years, Robert Abbott's tiny newspaper had become something almost unimaginable. The Chicago Defender was selling more than 200,000 copies every week. But even more remarkable was where those readers lived. Despite the name of the paper, 2 out of every 3 customers reading it weren't in Chicago at all. Rather, they were scattered across southern towns and northern cities Abbott himself had never even visited. The business got so popular that it proudly called itself the world's greatest weekly, and while many at the time saw it as a bit over the top for a long stretch of the 20th century, that claim wasn't just bold marketing. Rather, it was reality. Yet mainstream outlets still couldn't replicate what made it so popular. While many white-owned newspapers ignored or buried stories of racial violence, Abbott put them on the front page. Lynchings that other papers refused to acknowledge became impossible for his readers to ignore. And while the paper had become successful, that wasn't strong enough to keep it alive in the long term, as other outlets would sooner or later adapt to their strategy. What Abbott needed for his paper to thrive for decades to come was innovation. Apart from publishing jobs and business opportunities for men of color, Abbott understood that Black people also needed heroes, and so he decided to give them some. A young writer named Langston Hughes found one of his earliest regular platforms in the Defender. A teenage poet named Gwendolyn Brooks got her work printed in its pages years before she became the first Black writer to win a Pulitzer Prize. Black musicians, athletes, actors, and entrepreneurs often became household names among Defender readers long before the rest of America even knew they existed. The newspaper was now creating Black history in real time, and as the paper grew, so did Abbott's fortune. The man who had once struggled to afford paper and ink became one of the first self-made Black millionaires in American history. In 1919, he purchased a 3-story building on Indiana Avenue to serve as the Defender's permanent headquarters, a powerful symbol of just how far the business had come. His own home was even more impressive. To everyone's surprise, Abbott built a mansion on Chicago's South Side that would later earn designation as a National Historic Landmark. But it turned out not even immense success could change his curiosity about the world. As much as he could, Abbott would travel across Europe and South America, writing vivid travel stories for his readers back home. It was a freedom he wanted his readers to imagine for themselves, and they loved it. By the early 1930s, it looked as though everything Abbott touched turned to gold. It was the best time to play it safe, yet that was when he made the biggest gamble of his career. In 1931, he launched a glossy new publication called Abbott's Monthly, hoping lightning would strike twice. The magazine enjoyed a promising start, and for a while it looked like another winner. But he'd lose everything when the Great Depression arrived. He wasn't the only one, though, as many businesses stopped advertising almost overnight. Revenue dried up across the publishing industry, and by 1933, Abbott's Monthly was gone. It remains one of the very few major failures in Abbott's career, a reminder that even the smartest businessman can't control an economy in freefall. Yet what many find most interesting about this point in his life is that even with all the wealth he'd built, Abbott's personal life was a private nightmare. For one, he never had children of his own. His first marriage collapsed in a bitter and very public divorce in 1933, and it happened the same year his magazine folded. A year later, he married Edna Abbott, a widow nearly 20 years younger than him, whose life had been very different from the one he'd fought his way through. But right when it seemed there was a little hope on the horizon for settling down and running a lasting family, Abbott's health would quickly begin to fail. Through the 1930s, a kidney disease would slowly drain his strength. As he realized his time might be running short, he faced one final question that would shape everything after his passing. Who would inherit the empire? His answer was clear, yet it would end up dividing his family for years to come. Chapter 3. The 10-Year Legal War. Robert Abbott's chosen successor wasn't a son. It was his nephew, and his name was John H. Sengstacke, reportedly described by his legal predecessor as a quiet, disciplined young man. Abbott had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Abbott had personally paid for Sengstacke's education at Hampton Institute, financed additional training at a linotype school, and even helped send him to 2 universities. Abbott's underlying motive was building the future of the Chicago Defender through him. And in 1934, he brought Sengstacke into the company as his personal assistant. Before long, he promoted him to vice president and general manager, giving him responsibility over most parts of the business. As Abbott's illness worsened, Sengstacke quietly learned every department, every printing press, every editor, and every financial decision that kept the newspaper alive. By the end of the decade, the transition had already begun. Then, in February 1940, Robert Abbott died of Bright's disease at the age of 69. The funeral had barely ended before the fighting began. Abbott's will clearly named Sengstacke as the man meant to lead the Defender into its next chapter. But as we'll see, not everyone accepted that decision well. Edna Abbott, his widow, along with several allies on the company's board, challenged the will in court. What followed was no short disagreement, and it slowly became a 10-year legal war. On one side stood a widow convinced her husband's empire belonged elsewhere. On the other stood the nephew Abbott had personally trained for the job. Lawyers argued over every sentence of the will, every conversation Abbott had before his death, and every clue pointing toward what he truly intended. For 10 years, ownership of one of America's most influential black newspapers remained uncertain. But even in the middle of this conflict, something very interesting was happening. Readers never noticed, despite spending much of the 1940s trapped in courtrooms. Sengstacke never allowed the newspaper to miss a single weekly edition. While attorneys argued over who legally owned the presses, those same presses kept rolling every week without interruption. Millions of readers unfolded the Defender with no idea that the company producing it was fighting for its survival behind closed courtroom doors. Sengstacke's life was laborious at best and unbearable at its worst. From court hearings in the morning to editorial meetings in the afternoon and printing deadlines at night. Then he'd have to do it all over again the following week. Sengstacke spent most of his 30s carrying the weight of an empire he legally didn't yet control, refusing to let the family war spill onto the pages his readers depended on. Finally, in 1950, a full decade after Robert Abbott's death, the courts confirmed Sengstacke as the rightful leader of the Chicago Defender. The lawsuit was over, but at a huge cost. Chapter 4. The Second Empire. Winning the court battle turned out to be the easy part. The real question was what John Sengstacke would do now that the empire was finally his. Most people would have spent years repairing the damage from the costly 10-year lawsuit. Instead, Sengstacke did the opposite. He started building with the intention of creating an entire network. He expanded into Detroit with the Michigan Chronicle. He transformed the Defender's Memphis operation into its own newspaper, the Tri-State Defender. Then, in 1965, when the legendary Pittsburgh Courier collapsed, he stepped in, bought its remaining assets, and brought it back to life as the new Pittsburgh Courier. The Chicago Defender itself kept growing too. In 1956, Sengstacke made one of the boldest decisions in the paper's history by turning it from a weekly newspaper into a daily one. Readers no longer waited until the weekend. The Defender became part of their everyday lives. But it turned out newspapers were only part of his plan. Sengstacke knew that one successful paper could be ignored, but an entire network could not. So he founded the National Newspaper Publishers Association, bringing black-owned newspapers from across America under one organization. He served as its president 7 different times, helping publishers share resources, strengthen one another, and fight problems that no single paper could solve alone. Before long, the man nobody expected to inherit the Defender had now become one of the most influential media owners in America. And over time, that influence reached far beyond journalism. When black reporters were shut out of White House press conferences, Sengstacke personally pushed President Franklin Roosevelt to change the rules. Eventually, black journalists were allowed inside for the first time, opening doors that had been closed for generations. During the Second World War, his newspapers championed the famous Double Vive campaign with the message of gaining victory against fascism overseas and victory against racism back home. The message became so powerful that the FBI briefly investigated whether the Defender's reporting was too radical. Imagine that for a second. A newspaper that began with 25 cents had become important enough for the federal government to watch. Over the years, Sengstacke advised presidents from Franklin Roosevelt through Lyndon Johnson, using the Defender's influence to push for more opportunities for Black Americans in government, business, and public life. By almost any measure, Robert Abbott's little newspaper had become the largest Black-owned newspaper empire the United States had ever seen. But something else was happening inside the newsroom, something that would shape the future of America forever, even to this day. And to understand how, you'll have to first understand how the media worked in the late 40s to the late 50s. Back then, while buildings and newspapers could make money, it was only the people inside that made history, and hardly the brand. One of those people was Ethel Payne, a Defender reporter who became one of the first black women ever admitted into the White House press corps. While many reporters avoided uncomfortable topics, Payne did the opposite. She asked presidents about segregation, challenged officials on civil rights, and on one occasion asked questions that reportedly irritated President Dwight Eisenhower so much that the tension in the room became impossible to ignore. She eventually earned a nickname few journalists ever receive. The First Lady of the Black Press, the Defender kept producing voices like hers. Cartoonist Chester Commodore used sharp political drawings to criticize racism and inequality in ways a headline sometimes couldn't. Columnist Vernon Jarrett became one of Chicago's most respected political writers. Local leaders didn't just read his work. Many reportedly wanted to know what Jarrett thought before making important decisions. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Defender wasn't simply covering the civil rights movement, but was helping drive it. The paper strongly supported nonviolent protest, published stories mainstream newspapers often ignored, and pushed readers to stay engaged as Congress debated the laws that would eventually become the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Just as it had helped fuel the Great Migration decades earlier, the Defender was once again helping shape American history. That's perhaps why older readers often describe the newspaper as something much bigger than affordable ink on paper. After all, for many black families, it arrived every week on the kitchen table, and for decades, it told them where jobs were, which schools were opening, which laws designed against the blacks had changed, who was fighting for them, and who wasn't. To thousands of families, the Defender felt like a member of the family. And that is what makes what happened next even harder to understand. Because after surviving segregation, expensive and unexpected lawsuits, and 2 world wars, it turned out the greatest threat to the Defender wasn't the government or its competitors. Rather, it seemed to be time, and it was running fast. Chapter 5. The Fall of the Empire. Starting in the late 1950s, the Defender began to lose readers year after year. The timing seemed strange on the surface. After all, John Sengstacke was winning lawsuits, buying newspapers, and becoming one of the most respected figures in American journalism. So what was the problem exactly? The answer lies in the things the business stood for and advocated for. They were getting recognition from others beyond the black community, and it was happening fast. As it turned out, the very movement the Defender had helped build was changing the market. As mainstream newspapers slowly began covering black communities and television became a daily source of news, fewer readers depended on it for information they couldn't get anywhere else. By 1977, daily circulation had fallen to about 34,000 copies, down from more than 160,000 at its peak. By the 1990s, it had dropped even further. But Sengstacke refused to give up trying new ventures that would only end in loss and failure. But the paper that had once helped reshape America was no longer the powerhouse it had been. By May 1997, Sengstacke died at 84 years old, and with his death, the empire was headed for another family battle, one that would lead to its final fall. Why did this have to happen? Years before his death, Sengstacke had already decided what should happen next. In 1975, he placed the newspaper chain into a trust with one clear instruction. When he died, the papers were to be sold. Instead, that decision sparked years of chaos. While families members fought to stay involved, outside buyers competed for control. One deal approved in 1999 collapsed before it closed. Another $11 million offer approved in 2000 also fell apart after the buyer failed to secure financing. As the legal fight dragged on, the defender sat in limbo. Employees kept reporting the news without knowing who would own the company next. Circulation continued to fall, and every year spent arguing made the paper weaker. When Sengstacke was around, he never lost focus on publishing even with the countless backlash and legal controversies, but this time, it seemed the entire business was on the legal guillotine. The battle finally ended in 2003, 6 years after Sengstacke passed away. A group led by his nephew, Thomas Sengstacke, bought the newspaper chain for over $11 million through a new company called Real Times. In one sense, the family got the defender back, but one could also argue the empire Robert Abbott had built was gone. The real tragedy wasn't that one argument destroyed a $25 million business overnight, although that is the case on paper. It was that decades of lawsuits, ownership disputes, and missed opportunities kept the defender from adapting while the world changed around it. And by the time the fighting had finally stopped, there simply wasn't as much left to save. There are many other leaks, scandals, and controversies leading to the end of the business, but we'd love to hear them from you. Do you have any memories of reading The Defender? Do you still have a copy from back in the day? Please let us know about it down in the comments. If you want more stories about legacies that almost didn't survive their own families, subscribe to Black Status and tell us which story should be covered next. Until next time, take care.